The maintenance hangar at RAF Biggin Hill echoed with the sound of metal tools and shouted conversations on the evening of March 3, 1944. Flight Lieutenant Thomas William Ashcroft knelt beside his Supermarine Spitfire Mark IX, carefully measuring the aircraft's fuselage with a length of string and a carpenter's ruler, while his ground crew watched with expressions that ranged from bemusement to outright mockery. Ashcroft was 32 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards, a pre-war aeronautical engineer who had joined the RAF in 1940 and had somehow survived 4 years of combat through a combination of skill, caution, and obsessive attention to his aircraft's performance. He had 17 confirmed kills, a respectable score but nothing extraordinary, and he was known throughout his squadron less for his combat prowess than for his endless tinkering with his aircraft. Other pilots flew what they were given, trusted the engineers at Supermarine and Rolls-Royce to optimize performance, and focused on tactics and gunnery. Ashcroft could never leave well enough alone. He was always measuring something, calculating something, proposing modifications that the ground crew usually rejected as impractical or unnecessary. Tonight's project was his most ambitious yet, and his most ridiculed. For the past 3 weeks, Ashcroft had been working on a theory that the Spitfire's performance was being limited not by its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine or its basic airframe design, but by parasitic drag from small imperfections in the aircraft's surface finish, and from cooling air leaks around the engine cowling. He had calculated that if he could reduce this parasitic drag by even 5%, he could increase his aircraft's top speed by perhaps 10 to 15 miles per hour, a significant advantage in combat where speed often meant the difference between killing and being killed. The problem was that reducing parasitic drag required meticulous attention to surface finish, filling every gap and rivet depression, smoothing every joint, and ensuring that cooling air flowed through designed paths rather than leaking around the engine cowling. It was painstaking work that would take dozens of hours and would yield results that might be entirely negligible. His squadron commander, Wing Commander David Peterson, had listened to Ashcroft's proposal with thinly veiled skepticism 2 weeks earlier. Tom, the Spitfire was designed by some of the best aeronautical engineers in Britain. Supermarine spent years optimizing its performance. What makes you think you can improve on their work with string and putty in a maintenance hangar? Ashcroft had anticipated the question. Sir, Supermarine designed the Spitfire for mass production. They had to balance aerodynamic optimization with manufacturing practicality. Perfectly flush rivets and smooth surface finishes take time and skilled labor, which means they're expensive in mass production. My theory is that an individual aircraft, modified by hand with attention to detail that's impractical in a factory, can achieve performance beyond factory specifications. Peterson had shaken his head. And you want to spend how much time on this project? Approximately 80 hours, sir. My ground crew working in their spare time with my assistants. 80 hours to maybe gain 10 miles per hour. Tom, that's not efficient use of resources. We need aircraft in the air, not in the hangar being modified based on theoretical calculations. With respect, sir, 10 miles per hour could mean catching German fighters that are currently just out of reach. It could mean escaping when damaged and pursued. It could mean the difference between life and death. Peterson had considered this, then sighed. All right, you can proceed with your modification project, but on 3 conditions. First, you do the work in your own time and your ground crew's spare time, not on maintenance hours that should be spent on routine servicing. Second, if this doesn't work, you drop the subject and stop bothering me with modification proposals. Third, when this fails, which it probably will, you don't complain about having wasted 80 hours. Agreed? Agreed, sir. So for 3 weeks, Ashcroft and his ground crew had worked nights and weekends on the modification project. They had carefully filled every rivet depression on the Spitfire's wings and fuselage with putty, then sanded them smooth until the surface was as sleek as glass. They had sealed every gap around the engine, cowling with rubber gaskets, ensuring that cooling air entered only through designed intakes and exited only through designated outlets. They had polished the propeller blades to mirror smoothness, reducing their drag. They had even filled the gun ports with temporary fairings to reduce drag during the speed tests, though these would have to be removed for combat operations. The other pilots in the squadron had watched the project with amused disdain. Squadron leader James Wilkinson had made his opinion clear during a mess dinner. Ashcroft thinks he's going to make his Spitfire faster by filling in rivets and polishing things. Next, he'll be painting it with speed stripes and hanging rabbit's feet in the cockpit. It's embarrassing, honestly. The man has a degree in engineering, and he's behaving like a backyard mechanic working on a racing car. Flight Lieutenant Robert Davies had been more direct. "Tom, you're wasting your time. The Spitfire's performance is limited by engine power and basic aerodynamics, not by rivet heads. You could polish it until it glows in the dark, and it won't make a meaningful difference. The engineers at Supermarine already optimized everything that matters." Ashcroft had endured the mockery in silence, continuing his work with stubborn determination. He knew the theory was sound. Parasitic drag increased with the square of velocity, which meant that at high speeds, small reductions in drag could yield significant increases in top speed. The question was whether the modifications he could accomplish in a maintenance hangar would be sufficient to produce measurable results. On March 3rd, the modification work was finally complete. Ashcroft's Spitfire sat in the hangar looking almost unnaturally smooth, its surface gleaming, every rivet invisible under layers of filler and paint, the engine cowling sealed and gasketed with obsessive precision. Flight Sergeant William Harris, Ashcroft's crew chief, stood back and admired their work with cautious pride. "Well, sir, if nothing else, it's the prettiest Spitfire on the station. Whether it's any faster remains to be seen." "We'll find out tomorrow," Ashcroft replied. "I've scheduled speed trials for 0900 hours, straight and level runs at 20,000 feet, both directions to account for wind, with precise timing over a measured course. We'll compare the results to the baseline performance data we collected before starting the modifications." "And if it's not faster?" Harris asked. "If all we've done is waste 3 weeks making it shiny?" "Then I'll buy you and the crew a round of drinks and admit I was wrong," Ashcroft said. "But I don't think I'm wrong. The mathematics are sound." The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect conditions for speed trials. Ashcroft took off at 0850 hours and climbed to 20,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold, and where the Spitfire's Merlin engine performed optimally. He leveled off and accelerated to maximum cruise speed, then began his timed runs over a 10-mile course that had been precisely measured using ground markers. The first run, heading north, yielded a speed of 408 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, which converted to approximately 455 miles per hour true airspeed at this altitude. The second run, heading south, yielded 412 miles per hour, indicated about 460 miles per hour true airspeed. Ashcroft averaged the results, 457.5 miles per hour true airspeed. He checked his notes from the baseline trials conducted 3 weeks earlier, before the modifications. The baseline speed had been 441 miles per hour true airspeed. The difference was 16.5 miles per hour. His modifications had increased his Spitfire's top speed by nearly 17 miles per hour, significantly more than his conservative estimate of 10 to 15 miles per hour. Ashcroft felt a surge of vindication so intense it was almost painful. The theory had been correct. The 3 weeks of painstaking work had been worth it. His Spitfire was now measurably faster than any standard Mark IX, faster even than many of the newer models. He had taken an already excellent fighter and made it better through nothing more than attention to detail and understanding of aerodynamic principles. He landed at 10:15 hours and taxied to his dispersal area, where Flight Sergeant Harris was waiting with the rest of the ground crew. Ashcroft climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cold altitude, and handed Harris his notes. 457.5 miles per hour, true airspeed at 20,000 feet. That's 16.5 miles per hour faster than baseline. The modifications worked. Harris's eyes widened as he read the numbers. 17 miles per hour. Sir, that's extraordinary. That's not just faster, that's significantly faster. This aircraft can now outrun anything the Germans have, except maybe their newest jets. Word of the successful speed trials spread through the squadron within hours. By evening, every pilot on the station knew that Ashcroft's modified Spitfire had achieved speeds well above standard specifications. The mockery that had greeted his modification project evaporated, replaced by intense interest and not a small amount of envy. Wing Commander Peterson called Ashcroft to his office that evening. "Tom, I owe you an apology. When you proposed this modification project, I thought you were wasting time on a marginal improvement at best. 17 miles per hour is not marginal. That's a significant performance enhancement. I need you to document everything you did, every modification, every technique, so we can potentially replicate it on other aircraft." "I've been keeping detailed notes, sir. I can have a complete report ready within 2 days." "Good. I'm also going to recommend you for a commendation. This kind of initiative and technical innovation is exactly what the RAF needs." Ashcroft hesitated, then said, "Sir, I appreciate that, but I'd rather you didn't. The modifications worked on my aircraft under controlled conditions. I don't know if they'll work as well on other aircraft, or if the performance gains are worth the labor investment for the entire squadron. I'd like to test the modifications in actual combat before we consider widespread implementation." Peterson studied him for a moment. "You want to prove that the increased speed translates to combat advantage, not just speed trial numbers." "Yes, sir. Speed on a test course is one thing. Speed when it matters, in combat, is something else." "All right. You'll fly combat missions with your modified aircraft. If it proves as advantageous as the numbers suggest, we'll consider implementing the modifications across the squadron." "Fair enough?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." Ashcroft's first combat mission with his modified Spitfire came 3 days later, an escort mission for American B-17 bombers attacking an aircraft factory near Hanover. The mission profile was straightforward: rendezvous with the bombers over the English Channel, escort them to the target and back, engage any German fighters that attempted to intercept. Intelligence reported that the Luftwaffe had been concentrating its remaining experienced fighter units to defend critical industrial targets, so heavy opposition was expected. The bomber stream consisted of nearly 300 B-17s, a massive formation that stretched across miles of sky. Ashcroft's squadron, along with several other Spitfire squadrons and American P-51 Mustangs, provided escort at various altitudes. Ashcroft's flight was assigned high cover at 28,000 feet, where they could dive on any German fighters that attempted attacks from altitude. The flight across the North Sea and into German airspace was tense but uneventful. Then, as the bomber stream approached the target, the radio erupted with contact reports. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high, multiple contacts. I count 20 plus, looks like Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. High cover, watch for the dive attacks." Ashcroft scanned the sky above and saw them, a formation of German fighters at 32,000 feet, positioning for diving attacks on the bombers below. Standard Luftwaffe tactics, using altitude advantage to make high-speed passes and then climbing back to safety before the escorts could react. Except this time, one escort could react. Ashcroft's modified Spitfire was faster than a standard Mark IX, and every bit of that speed advantage would be useful in the next few minutes. "Redcoat leader, this is Redcoat 5. I'm climbing to engage the high cover." "Negative, Redcoat 5. You can't reach them before they dive. Maintain position." But Ashcroft had already done the calculations. His Spitfire could climb at 4,100 feet per minute at this altitude. The German fighters were 4,000 feet above him. If he started climbing now, he could reach their altitude in just under 60 seconds. By the time they completed their positioning and started their dive, he would be in position to intercept. "Redcoat leader, trust me, I can reach them." Ashcroft didn't wait for approval. He advanced his throttle to maximum power and pulled his Spitfire into a steep climb, the Merlin engine screaming at full power. The aircraft responded beautifully, the reduced parasitic drag from his modifications allowing it to climb more efficiently than a standard Spitfire. The altimeter wound up rapidly: 29,000 feet, 30,000, 31,000. The German fighters saw him coming, probably couldn't believe that a British fighter was climbing so rapidly to intercept them. They had been operating with the assumption that they could stay above the escorts, that their altitude advantage made them safe. Ashcroft was about to prove them wrong. At 32,000 feet, level with the German formation, he rolled inverted and pulled into a diving attack on the nearest Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot, surprised by the sudden appearance of a Spitfire at his altitude, tried to dive away, using the FW-190's excellent diving speed to escape. But Ashcroft's modified Spitfire was faster. He followed the diving FW-190, maintaining position, slowly closing the distance. At 400 yards, he opened fire. His first burst missed, the rounds passing behind the frantically maneuvering German. He corrected, leading more, and fired again. This time his rounds hit, stitching across the FW-190's right wing and fuselage. Pieces flew off, smoke erupted. The German fighter rolled violently and fell away, trailing fire. One down. Ashcroft pulled out of his dive and climbed again, his speed advantage allowing him to regain altitude quickly. The other German fighters had abandoned their planned attack on the bombers and were now scattered, their tactical cohesion broken by the unexpected appearance of a British fighter at their altitude. Some were diving away, fleeing. Others were trying to engage, but they were cautious now, wary. Over the next 15 minutes, the dogfight spread across several miles of sky. Ashcroft used his speed advantage repeatedly, catching German fighters that tried to extend away, escaping from pursuers that couldn't match his top speed, positioning for attacks that should have been impossible given the relative performance of a standard Spitfire versus German fighters. He shot down a second FW-190 that made the mistake of trying to outrun him in level flight. At 28,000 feet, Ashcroft's modified Spitfire was faster than anything the Luftwaffe had except their experimental jets. And there were no jets in this fight. The German pilot probably couldn't understand why this particular Spitfire was catching him when he should have been able to escape. He found out when Ashcroft's rounds hit his engine and sent him tumbling toward the earth below. When Ashcroft finally ran low on ammunition and fuel and had to break off, he had 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable. More importantly, the German high-cover formation had been completely disrupted, forced to abandon their planned attack on the bombers, scattered across the sky by a single British fighter that was faster than they expected. The flight back to England was uneventful, and when Ashcroft landed at Biggin Hill, he found half the squadron waiting to hear about his mission. Wing Commander Peterson was there, along with several pilots who had previously mocked his modification project. 2 confirmed kills, Ashcroft reported, both Focke-Wulf 190s. I engaged from high altitude, used the speed advantage to intercept their high cover formation before they could attack the bombers. The modifications worked exactly as predicted. I could catch aircraft that were trying to escape, could escape from aircraft pursuing me, could position for attacks that wouldn't have been possible in a standard Spitfire. Squadron leader Wilkinson, who had mocked the project most vocally, spoke up. "Tom, I owe you an apology. I said you were wasting your time. I was wrong. If your modifications can give that kind of performance advantage, we need to implement them across the entire squadron." "It's not that simple," Ashcroft cautioned. "The modifications took 80 hours per aircraft. We have 16 Spitfires in the squadron. That's 1,280 hours of work, which translates to weeks of intensive labor. We'd have to take aircraft out of service for the modifications, which would reduce our operational strength in the short term." Peterson considered this. "What if we modified 2 aircraft at a time, rotating them through? We'd maintain operational strength while gradually upgrading the entire squadron." "That could work, sir, but I'd recommend starting with just 4 aircraft, as a test. If the combat results are consistently positive, we expand the program. If not, we've only invested the resources in 4 aircraft rather than 16. Conservative approach. I like it. Proceed with 4 aircraft, starting with the volunteers' machines." Every pilot in the squadron volunteered, but Peterson selected 3 based on their experience and flying skills. Squadron leader Wilkinson, Flight Lieutenant Davies, and Flight Lieutenant Martin Cooper. Over the next month, these 3 aircraft underwent the same meticulous modifications that Ashcroft's had received. The work was tedious and exacting, requiring perfect surface smoothness, precise sealing of all gaps, and careful attention to details that most mechanics would have dismissed as irrelevant. But the results, when the modified aircraft were tested, were consistent. Each gained between 15 and 18 miles per hour of top speed, with Wilkinson's aircraft achieving the highest gain at nearly 19 miles per hour. By May 1944, 4 pilots in Ashcroft's squadron were flying modified Spitfires that were significantly faster than standard models. The combat results were dramatic. In a 2-month period, these 4 pilots accounted for 23 confirmed kills, with only 1 loss, and that loss was to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. They could engage when they wanted, escape when necessary, and consistently achieved positions that should have been impossible in standard aircraft. Word of the modifications spread beyond the squadron. Other units requested information about Ashcroft's techniques. The Air Ministry sent engineers to examine the modified aircraft and to interview Ashcroft about his methods. By July 1944, the modification program had been officially adopted as a recommended procedure for Spitfire units, though it remained optional due to the labor-intensive nature of the work. Ashcroft was promoted to squadron leader and was asked to write a technical manual on aerodynamic optimization for frontline units. But the most satisfying moment came in August 1944, during a mission over France. Ashcroft's flight encountered a formation of 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the latest G model, which were among the fastest piston-engine fighters Germany possessed. The Bf-109G was capable of 400 miles per hour at optimal altitude, and German pilots had been taught to use their speed advantage to avoid disadvantageous combats with Allied fighters. But Ashcroft's modified Spitfire was faster. When one of the Bf-109s tried to escape by diving away at maximum speed, Ashcroft followed and slowly reeled him in, the gap closing meter by meter until he was in firing range. The German pilot probably couldn't understand what was happening, probably couldn't comprehend why this Spitfire was catching him when he should have been able to escape. Ashcroft fired a 3-second burst that hit the Bf-109's engine and wing root. The German fighter began trailing smoke and lost speed rapidly. The pilot bailed out, his parachute deploying at dangerously low altitude, but successfully. Ashcroft pulled up and rejoined his formation, and over the radio he heard Flight Lieutenant Davies laughing. "That German pilot is going to file a report that makes no sense. He'll say a Spitfire caught him in level flight at maximum speed, and his intelligence officers won't believe him. They'll think he panicked or made a mistake." "Let them think that," Ashcroft replied. "The longer they don't understand why some of our Spitfires are faster, the better." But the Germans did eventually figure it out. Intelligence intercepts in September 1944 revealed that Luftwaffe units were being warned about modified British fighters with unusual performance characteristics, and German pilots were being instructed to avoid prolonged chases with Spitfires because some had been observed at speeds that exceeded known specifications. The psychological impact was significant. German pilots, already struggling against overwhelming Allied numerical superiority, now had to contend with the knowledge that some Allied fighters were faster than expected, that the performance data they had been given was no longer reliable. By the end of 1944, approximately 40 Spitfires across various RAF squadrons had received Ashcroft's modifications, and the pilots flying them had achieved kill ratios significantly above average. The modifications became a mark of distinction, with pilots competing for assignment to modified aircraft. Ashcroft himself finished the war with 31 confirmed kills, most of them achieved after his modifications had been implemented. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and was promoted to Wing Commander. After the war, Ashcroft returned to aeronautical engineering, working for several British aircraft manufacturers and eventually teaching at Imperial College London. He occasionally gave lectures about his wartime modifications, always emphasizing that innovation didn't require revolutionary new technology, just careful attention to fundamental principles and willingness to question assumptions. In a 1968 lecture to engineering students, Ashcroft was asked why the professionals at Supermarine hadn't implemented the modifications he had discovered. His answer was illuminating. "Supermarine's engineers were brilliant, and they understood everything I did. But they were designing for mass production, where every hour of labor has a cost and where perfection is the enemy of good enough. They optimized the Spitfire for the constraints they faced, build aircraft quickly and cheaply enough to equip the entire RAF. My modifications required 80 hours of hand labor per aircraft, which was impractical for factory production, but practical for individual aircraft in the field. I didn't know something they didn't know, I just had different constraints and could therefore pursue different solutions. But they mocked you, the student pressed. Your squadron mates said you were wasting time. They did, Ashcroft admitted, and they weren't entirely wrong to be skeptical. Most modification projects fail or produce marginal results. Mine happened to work, and to work better than I expected, but it could easily have been a waste of time. The mockery didn't bother me because I knew the theory was sound. I had done the mathematics, understood the physics, and was confident in my approach. When people mock you for trying something unconventional, it's usually because they're risk-averse and afraid of failure. The question you have to ask yourself is whether your idea is based on sound principles or just wishful thinking. If it's sound, proceed despite the mockery. If it's wishful thinking, listen to the critics. Thomas Ashcroft died in 1989 at the age of 77, having contributed to the design of several post-war British aircraft and having trained thousands of engineering students. His obituary in the Times focused as much on his wartime modifications as on his professional career, noting that his initiative had demonstrated how individual innovation could enhance even the best designed equipment. At his funeral, several former RAF pilots who had flown modified Spitfires spoke about how Ashcroft's work had given them an edge in combat, how the extra 17 miles per hour had made the difference between life and death on missions when they could catch German fighters that were trying to escape or could escape from dangerous situations. One former pilot, Air Vice Marshal Robert Davies, retired, told a story that captured Ashcroft's essence. In 1944, I was flying a modified Spitfire that Tom had personally supervised. We encountered a German formation, and I got separated from my flight while pursuing a Bf-109. I damaged him, but didn't shoot him down, and suddenly I found myself alone with 6 more German fighters diving on my position. Standard tactics said I was dead. I should have been dead. But I had 17 extra miles per hour from Tom's modifications. I pointed my nose east and ran at maximum speed, and those German fighters couldn't catch me. They tried for 5 minutes, firing at extreme range, but I was just slightly faster, and that slight difference was enough. I made it home because Tom Ashcroft had spent 80 hours filling rivet holes and sealing gaps. He saved my life with string, putty, and mathematical calculations. That's the kind of engineer and officer the RAF needed. Today, several of Ashcroft's modified Spitfires survive in museums, their surfaces still showing the careful finish that made them faster than their factory-fresh counterparts. Plaques beside them explain the modifications and their impact, noting that these aircraft represented speeds at the absolute limit of what piston-engine Spitfires could achieve. Aviation historians debate whether Ashcroft's modifications actually created the fastest Spitfires on the front, or whether that honor belongs to later models with more powerful engines. But there's no debate about the principle he demonstrated, that careful attention to details that others dismissed as trivial could yield significant performance improvements. The lesson extends beyond aviation. Ashcroft proved that innovation doesn't always require new technology or revolutionary breakthroughs. Sometimes it requires applying known principles with care and precision that goes beyond what's practical in mass production. Sometimes it requires questioning whether the performance limitations you've been told are absolute are actually just economic constraints from manufacturing. And sometimes it requires the courage to pursue an idea despite mockery from people who don't understand your reasoning or who are uncomfortable with unconventional approaches. They mocked his homemade modification, said he was wasting time filling rivet holes and sealing gaps, said that factory engineers had already optimized everything that mattered. They were wrong. Thomas Ashcroft proved that his modified Spitfire could achieve speeds 17 miles per hour faster than standard models, could catch German fighters that should have been able to escape, could survive situations that should have been fatal. He proved that meticulous attention to seemingly trivial details could create measurable combat advantage. And he proved that the engineer who questions assumptions and tests theories, even when mocked for doing so, can sometimes achieve what the experts said was impossible. His legacy is not just the faster Spitfires he created, but the principle he demonstrated: that excellence is found in details, that optimization is never truly complete, and that the person willing to do painstaking work that others dismiss as pointless can sometimes achieve extraordinary results. the fastest Spitfire on the front was faster not because of better technology, but because one pilot understood that the difference between good and excellent lies in the details that most people never notice.